So I want to remind you of a couple of things. Let's start with the title. There's no philosophy of the short story or philosophy of the sestina. Only if you speak very loosely. So if you're talking about something like the philosophy of sails or the philosophy of, I don't know, shoes. So how come it's okay to pair philosophy and tragedy in this way? So let's start with tragedy. A lot of this you know already. We started with it. If you speak of the great age of Greek tragedy, you're really talking about less than 100 years, 499 to 505 BC. It's also, you're not talking about a lot of places. It's really Athens. They were all produced in the same theater, the theater of Dionysus on the hill, on the Acropolis, on the side of the Acropolis, in Athens. So we think of it, we may do it favorably, some of us may do it critically, but we think of tragedies as sort of Greek tragedies as sort of cornerstone of a canon in what is called, again, sometimes favorably, sometimes not, as the Western tradition. But for them, of course, that's not what it was. I mean, when Sophocles and Aeschylus sat down to write their tragedies, they weren't saying, oh, I'm establishing, a canon that's going to be read in Bronxville in 2018. For them, it was a novelty, unestablished. And the tragedians themselves were very aware that they were doing something quite different. So when you read Sophocles, you're not reading someone who takes it for granted that he's a tragedian. You ask Brian Morton what he is, and he might say a teacher, he might say a writer, but I think you got a pretty good chance that he'll say a novelist. And by the way, a really wonderful novelist. That's why I picked him as my example. But Sophocles was a military leader. He was a very close friend of Pericles. Aeschylus was, it was rumored, it's not a rumor, it's just an old story, we just know whether it's true or not, to have on his tomb a sentence that reads something like, "Here lies a marathon man." And what that meant was that he fought in the Battle of Marathon, where the Athenians defeated the invading Persians. So in some way for him, that was the thing that he was going to be known for, not necessarily as the playwright who gave us the Oresteia. So the tragedy for them was very unlike our relation to the novel, which is so common that I think it's possible to set out to write a novel without ever having reflected on what it is and what makes it special. So there's something very self-reflective about tragedy, necessarily because they're at the beginning and they're trying to figure out what it is that they're doing. So look at it from the other side, the side of philosophy. We use the word tragedy all the time. Tsunamis are tragedies. An injury to LeBron James' hamstring is a tragedy. There is seems to be a really easy connection between tragedy and life. And as a literary form, tragedy seems to claim to be the truth of life. Not just somebody's life, but life in general. And this doesn't seem to be as true or as obviously true of the novel. In the Oedipus Tyrannus, Oedipus is called by the chorus the paradigm of the human. So you could say tragedy, philosophy, they're really connected in two ways. Tragedy involves self-reflection about what it means to represent human life, and it involves making claims about human life as a whole. Okay, what about tragedy in philosophy? It's very ordinary for philosophers to single out tragedy and talk about it at some length. We know about Aristotle, of course, because we've done him for the whole semester on Poetics, but also Plato all over the place in the books that are supposed to be about poetry and the books that are not. It's the tyrant in the ninth book of the Republic is modeled on Oedipus. Plato talks repeatedly about, in the laws, about, there's a wonderful line where he says they're establishing a new political order, or figuring out what kind of new political order is to be established in Crete. And there's a man called the Athenian stranger talking to two old men, a Cretan and a Spartan, about what the order will be. And one of them says to him, especially since he's an Athenian, and Athens is famous for tragedy, what about the tragedians? And the Athenian says, well, if the tragedians should come to us and ask us to enter our city, we should say to them that we already have tragedy. The very best and highest of tragedy is the laws of our city, and tells them essentially to get lost. So Plato, Aristotle, but later as well, it's present in Hegel, in the Phenomenology, the long account of Antigone, in Nietzsche, whose first published book is the book, The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music, in Heidegger, Introduction to Metaphysics, a long account of that famous Stasimon in Antigone. So it's very standard. It happens also in Schopenhauer and others. It's very standard for philosophers to talk about tragedy, much more so than they talk about any other literary form. Now, on the one hand, Plato and Nietzsche seem to share a view of poetry generally as at odds with philosophy. 10th book of the Republic, Plato talks about an ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry, grounded in poetry's status as a mere imitation, a mimesis of reality. And then in the 16th section of The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche calls Socratism the, quote, noblest opposition to the tragic worldview, which of course Nietzsche thinks is the deepest worldview. So a tension between poetry and philosophy, but specifically tragedy, in both of these thinkers. On the other hand, Aristotle goes so far as to praise poetry as philosophic. You know that in the Poetics, and he gives an account of it as imitative, as mimetic in the beginning of the book, and therefore, in a way, it's the same reason that Plato seems to think it's bad, Aristotle seems to think it's good. So we're confronted, we think about it for a minute, with the spectacle of an apparent quarrel within philosophy about the relation of poetry to philosophy. And it's a quarrel between two people who could reasonably be called the most poetic philosophers ever to have written, Plato and Nietzsche. On the one hand, and on the other hand, Aristotle's defense of poetry as philosophic, Aristotle, who seems, at first glance, I hope you all know this isn't true by now, to seem the most prosaic of all the philosophers. Still, all of them seem to agree that tragedy and poetry and philosophy have to be paired. Different reasons for pairing them, but they put them together. So we paired them. That's what we did this semester. With what result? We've covered a lot of ground. The Agamemnon, the libation bearers, the Eumenides, Oedipus the king, Oedipus the Colonus, Antigone, Iphigenia among the Taurians, Bacchae, Hippolytus. It would really be impossible, and I'm not going to do it. Sometimes you try to do the impossible, sometimes you avoid it. I'm not going to try to summarize. Maybe it's even needless, given the peculiar tendency of Greek tragedy to raise the question of tragedy in tragedy. That last is certainly true of Eumenides. It's the story of Orestes and the Furies that gets brought to Athens, and not the actual Furies that get brought to Athens. Aeschylus uses the Eumenides, the play, to bury the problem of Clytemnestra deeply in the Athenian psyche. This is true as well of the Oedipus at Colonus. It's not that Athens or Athenians really need to worry about stepping on the hallowed ground of Oedipus' grave. And so it's not that they're in constant danger of sacrilege, and so feel a kind of generic guilt. It's rather that the story of Oedipus is responsible for this. Now, it's clearly on Euripides' mind in the Bacchae. Remember that scene described for us where Pentheus says he'd pay money to sit on the hillside and watch the pain of the women below him. Of course, it's present as well in the whole series of things that come under the formula Hosias Hecate, for form's sake, for the sake of the holy, in the Iphigenia among the Taurians. So the Bacchae was all about Dionysus as the only god who's directly visible to us because he's the god of illusion, of theater, of seeing double. So the tragedians themselves have been summing up tragedy for us all semester. Still, since Aristotle speaks of poetry as more philosophical than history, and Plato announces an ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry, what is it that makes tragedy so special? Think, for example, of Homer. We can read Homer, but Aristotle calls him the best poet in a book that's designed to single out tragedy as the best form of poetry. So it's a very peculiar thing Aristotle does. He spends however many pages gradually moving to this celebration of tragedy in some detail as the greatest form of poetry, and then promptly in the very end tells you, oh, by the way, Homer is the best poet. Let's start, this is a detour, but detours are good. Start with the fact that Homer has given us two great poems, Iliad and the Odyssey, seemingly very different from one another. You could say the Iliad stands to the Odyssey as war stands to peace, as action stands to thought. If Odysseus is the greatest thinker who goes to Troy, Achilles is presented to us as the greatest actor. So it looks as though between the two of them, between the two poems, the war poem and the peace poem, you notice Tolstoy claims to be doing everything, war and peace. You could say we get rational animal, we get human being. Now on a closer look, it's kind of interesting. In the 21st book of the Odyssey, Homer describes Odysseus as stringing his bow as though it were a lyre. That's one of those lines that's a kind of tip-off to the fact that he thinks that you're wrong to understand Odysseus as simply passively thinking or simply active. So Homer's presentation of Odysseus is also interesting because he presents him as the man who tells at least a third of his own story. In books 9 through 12 of the Odyssey, it's not Homer, it's Odysseus who's the narrator. Interesting, I think I mentioned this at least one of the group conferences, that it's in books 9 through 12 that you get the Lastrygonian giants, the Cyclopes, the monsters, Scylla and Charybdis. You get Hades, the trip to Hades, you get Circe, you get the cattle of the sun. I'm leaving some out, but you get the point. I think, with very few exceptions, all of the monstrous things in the Odyssey are introduced by Odysseus when he's justifying himself and telling his story in Phaeacia. And of course, he's probably the most famous liar in antiquity, so it's very unclear what the status of these monsters really are. So Odysseus, in any case, relates the action of his own story, and therefore Odysseus is, on the one hand, anonymous, neutral, mind. There's that wonderful story about the Cyclops. He steals inside his cave and takes his men there just out of sheer curiosity. He's no reason they have. They've just come from a place where they have everything they need, but he has to get inside the Cyclops cave, Polyphemus. And so he gets in there and they get trapped. And then he finally gets them out by hiding them under the sheep or goats, I forget which, of the Cyclops. And he gets back to his ship and not able to let well enough alone. He has told the Cyclops that his name, when the Cyclops says, "Who are you?" he says, "I'm Utis," which means in Greek, no one, nobody. And then he escapes, and as he, typical Odysseus, as he's escaping in his ship, he yells out to the Cyclops, "Tell them that it was Odysseus, son of Laertes, who did this to you." Really stupid, because he gets in a lot of trouble for it. But before that, the other Cyclopes from around hear the Cyclops wailing. He's been blinded by Odysseus. And they ask who did this to him, and he says, "Utis." He thinks that's Odysseus' name. Utis means no one. And the other Cyclopes walk away saying, "Oh, well, if no one did this to you, we're not going to do anything." But they use another word, Greek word for no one, metis. Change the accents, and metis means mind. It's one of many indications in the book that Odysseus is presented to us as a kind of pure mind, purely detached. So what's interesting is that on the one hand, with regard to his name, he identifies himself as mind. And then on the other hand, we're told later in the book that his grandfather called him Odysseus, and it comes from the verb odissao, which means to be angry. So anger and mind put together in Odysseus reminds you of something that's Oedipus, of the Oedipus Tyrannus. The question then for the book turns out to be how to fit these two things together, and that's the problem really of the whole poem. Can Oedipus be both of these things? Purely detached on the one hand and angry and engaged on the other. So the Odyssey is not just about pure thought, not about peace in that way. It seems somehow more comprehensive than the Iliad. And then you turn to the Iliad and you discover that it has its own complications, which I don't want to go into at length, but just for one, the purity of active Achilles, the pure actor, ends up toward the end of the book, this famous scene of Achilles chasing Hector around Troy and killing him. The deed, once you've worked it through, turns out to be remarkably self-reflective. I think we've done this either in class or in conference, but Hector's at the moment that Achilles kills him, wearing the armor that was stripped off Achilles' friend Patroclus, which was Achilles' old armor. Homer points this out to us by saying he knew exactly where to stab him because he knew where the joint in the armor was. So this Greek armor covers up the face. So you have a beautiful, if you're doing it in a movie, it would be a beautiful example of Achilles killing Achilles. And that makes a certain sense. Think about self-consciousness, or reflections on self-consciousness. Means on the one hand, self-awareness, and on the other hand, somehow being ashamed of yourself. Achilles, in his moment of triumph, is presented to us as killing himself and as, in a way, guilty for having done what he's done. There are reasons for that. It looks as though he knew very well that Patroclus would probably die if he allowed him to go into battle. But then it turns out that the poem that's not supposed to be self-reflective presents us with a hero who is, in a way, self-reflective. And so it's not the poem we thought it was, and Homer is doing, in both of these poems, a depiction of something quintessentially human that has to do with not only acting, but being aware of one's action. So he writes two poems that seem at first to divide the world between them, but in fact reproduce within themselves the very division that they had thought to make. This is what Aristotle calls an indeterminate dyad. So in the Symposium, there's a story Diotima tells the young Socrates about the birth of Eros. Eros is presumably born of, you're trying to explain why erotic longing is this weird combination of poverty in the sense that you don't have what you want, you most want, and on the other hand, an indication that you're very happy and you do in a way have what you want. So what is this odd combination of these two? And so Diotima, this prophetess, tells Socrates that there was a festival. It was at the birth of Eros, and at the birthday of Aphrodite, I'm sorry, and Poverty contrives a scheme. Poverty is a goddess who contrives a scheme to get the god Resource to sleep with her. And the goal is to create a child, and the child is Eros, a combination of poverty and resource. So it's a sort of symbolic representation of what the nature of erotic longing is. And then you think about it for a minute and you realize, oh, wait a minute. She had to be pretty clever and resourceful to figure out that that's what she needed to do. And so it turns out that the thing that you're trying to get in Eros is already present all by itself. This division between poverty and resource already present in her mother, in his mother. And so you're getting this very beautiful representation of one of these situations. We've seen them all year long, where it looks as though you have a clear-cut, one of these has got to work, right? It looks as though you have a clear-cut division between, you've got Eros, and then poverty and resource as the constitutive elements presented here poetically, but then you look at what poverty does, and it's already got poverty and resource. And it looks as though that's the way Homer has understood his two poems as well. The war poem is not just a war poem. The peace poem is not just a peace poem. Now, all of this should be familiar. It's a problem that's been with us all semester. Think of justice in the Oresteia. The need to combine personal interest on the one hand with detached objectivity on the other hand, so that Electra first longs for an avenger on the one hand and her brother, and she doesn't understand that the two can be one. Orestes has an interest in doing it because it was his father who got killed, and the avenger would have a kind of detached perspective, and one could be sure that the thing was done fairly. It culminates with the transformation of the Furies into the Eumenides in the last play. Gods dedicated to avenging specific blood crimes turn into gods who somehow point to the incompleteness of human control, to the incompleteness of the political in general. They turn out, for example, to be weather gods. But of course, they're no good to Athena if they're just that. There has to be something of the Furies remaining within them, or what's the point of the whole thing? And it occurs as well in the split between the old female gods and the new male gods at the beginning of the play and throughout the play, which we saw repeatedly as a tension between individual persons on the one hand, Ares, and universal principles on the other hand, war. Or in the Oedipus Tyrannus, the strange but necessary coincidence in Oedipus of anger and wisdom, which is just the doubling of Tyrannos in the title as tyrant and king, or in the recurring problem in Euripides of the distinction between the real on the one hand and the image or the ritual on the other hand, or in the uncanny way in which the Denos as canny is both at odds with and dependent upon Denos understood as uncanny in Antigone. Somehow everything we have read this semester has to do with this split in human nature. This, though, everything I've said though so far, seems to indicate that tragedy is not so different from poetry generally. Not so different, for example, from Homer's poetry. It doesn't help us to understand why philosophers have been so preoccupied with the form of tragedy. What makes it different? Another detour to help. The Phaedrus is one of Plato's dialogues on love. There are 3 speeches about love. The third speech, the great speech that Socrates gives, is the one about the soul as 2 horses and a charioteer who fly to the heavens. In this speech, Socrates gives an account according to which, insofar as the world makes sense to us at all, it's because there are what he calls hyper-Uranian beings, super-heavenly beings. In other Platonic dialogues, things very similar to this would be called the ideas, or sometimes translated as the forms. So the just things in the world make sense because of an idea, a principle of justice. Courage, moderation work the same way. Human being, trees work the same way. The fact that we can identify things in the world as of a certain kind, it seems to be grounded in the ability to grasp what it is that binds them together. These in the Phaedrus are called hyper-Uranian beings. Now, the story, the myth tells us that our souls are driven by Eros to ascend through heaven to the peak of the heavens and grasp, look out, just poke your head above the heavens and see these beings. But as it turns out with human things, more often than not, we fail. And we get our heads up a little bit and only see some of them, and that distorts our vision of the way the whole hangs together, or we don't get up at all. And so in general, human beings lack what we need, what we would really need in order to understand our world and what makes it a whole, what puts it together. Still, the story Socrates tells us, we have some solace, since one and only one of these super heavenly beings appears here below, under the heavens. And that's the beautiful. Now, think of it this way. I'm going to use this example despite the fact that there are probably a lot of you who don't even know how to read analog clocks anymore. But think of this as your world. So let's give it a base, okay? It's like a clock. If you could see inside it, it'd have all these parts. They would be moving around and It'd be like that, what's the old movie, not Charlie Chaplin, the other one gets caught in a world of one of you filmed. Yeah, is it modern, is it Modern Times? Who is that? No, I don't mean Chaplin, I mean the other one. Yeah, it's a Keaton movie, right? But anyway, it doesn't matter. You're inside this clock, and it's got gears, and it's got all sorts of things. And because you're inside it, it was like chaos to you. You don't have any idea of what it is as a whole, and so there's a lot of movement. It's all going around, but you don't even know where one part starts and the other one stops, and you have no idea why these gears are grinding. It looks like utter chaos. It looks utterly unintelligible to you. Except you get saved, because inside this clock, there's a model of another clock that you can look at. You can examine it and say, oh, I see what this is. It's just this and this. And so you begin to get a sense of the whole in which you live, because there's a part within the whole that gives you an image of the whole. Now, there are within some things that somehow imitate the whole, and so provide us with some access to the whole. They are what they are by pointing beyond themselves. That should sound familiar. You should think that he's about to pull out the photograph of his wife again. But to do that, they have to have a frame around them. It's as though you have to be able to say, when you look at it, it's not connected to it's there for its own sake. It's there to somehow show you, it's in a way independent and sufficient, and you experience it in that way on the one hand, and on the other hand, its sole purpose is to point beyond itself. And so it presents itself as for the sake of something, for the something else. That means that they're screaming at you these things, look at me for what I am as a whole, and not as a part. Instead, look at me as apart from the whole. I'm not a part of the whole, I'm apart from the whole. That's what all poetry does. That's what all art does. It's what makes it special. In this sense, not in the trivial sense, all art aims to be beautiful, paradigmatic. It doesn't mean pretty. It means to give you this is, in a way, what it means for it to be beautiful. But of course, it is in the whole. It is in the little clocks and the big clock, and therefore it's necessarily also a part. Its claims for apartness are a lie, an exaggeration, absolutely necessary and necessarily deceiving. So you could say this, and it's only a beginning to what you'd have to say. All poetry, all making designed to be an object of contemplation, all making, all poems that put frames around themselves and say, look at me, necessarily aim at the beautiful. And because they aim at the beautiful, they're in some sense necessarily partial. Now, some poetry is aware of this fact and even points to it. I think this is true. What I tried to do with my long digression on Homer was to show you that I think that's what Homer does. That's what makes his poetry so good. And interestingly enough, it's why Aristotle calls him the most tragic of the poets. But tragedy as a form, which is what we've been looking at all semester, has as its aim to show us the necessity of this partiality. Or you could say, if all poetry represents the beautiful and is therefore necessarily partial, tragedy is a beautiful representation of the beautiful in its partiality. And that's why the philosophers turn to it so frequently. So you could say, not an accident that good poetry, that Homer could be the greatest of the poets. Not an accident because he is so self-reflective, because in a way, he too is designed in showing, is aiming at showing you the tension within human beings between the part that looks and the part that does. Interesting that he does it in two different ways. That's a kind of sign that he knows that you can't flat out say it, you have to come at it at an angle. There's a sense in which Plato, for example, is doing the same thing in all of his dialogues, but he did write 35 dialogues, so he can't be just doing the same thing. So apparently, and while this is true of tragedy, that tragedy is always an attempt to represent in some form the failure of the beautiful image to give you what it seemed to, what it was supposed to give you. Moderation is a virtue. Oh yeah, look at the Poetics. Loyalty to your family is a virtue. Oh yeah, look at Antigone. The king as the perfect father who cares not for himself, that's what politics at its best would be. Oh yeah, look at the Oedipus Tyrannus. So it turns out that tragedy picks out a particular way in which we necessarily idealize our world and shows you in a poetic way that that undercuts itself. Now you need to listen to the modifier in a poetic way, because it does mean that the poetry that tragedy gives you is a beautiful representation of the failure of beautiful images. And so it too is poetic. In a specific way, you could say, that's what we saw in Euripides when we saw, okay, he means for tragedy to provide a kind of rebarbarizing of us in a way that will bring our rituals back to life. But of course, it's not a real rebarbarizing, it's a ritual rebarbarizing, and it can fall into the same kind of triteness, really, that most rituals eventually fall into. Now, this all has something to do with where we ended up in Euripides. Euripides' emphasis on Greeks versus barbarians. You could say this. Herodotus says more or less this. There are really three sorts of tribes. The first version of a tribe knows no way other than its own way. And so it's unaware that its way is a way. This is what led Goethe, for example, to say, there's a certain sense in which you don't know what language is until you've learned a second language. Leads Rousseau in the essay on the origin of languages to say very early, and I think like the second sentence, it becomes clear that you, in a way, don't know what a language is until you've heard a stranger speak another language, and you say, you mean mine isn't all there is? There's something else? So on the one hand, a tribe that is utterly unaware of any alternative to itself. On another, the other version is a tribe that does know about alternatives and hates them. Herodotus has a beautiful story about that I want to read to you. You know that when Herodotus tells a story about Persians or Indians or something like that, you have to take it with a grain of salt, because underneath it all, he's a philosophical historian, and he's not so much interested in whether he's telling you the truth. Okay. There are indeed on every hand clear proofs that Cambyses, we don't need that. For if there were a proposition put before mankind, according to which each should, after examination, choose the best customs in the world, each nation would certainly think its own customs the best. Indeed, it is natural for no one but a madman to make a mockery of such things. That this is how all men think about their customs, one can see from many other pieces of evidence, and from the following case in particular. Darius, who was a king of Persia, during his own rule, called together some of the Greeks who were in attendance on him and asked them what would they take to eat their dead fathers. They said that no price in the world would make them do so. After that, Darius summoned those Indians who are called Colatians, who do eat their parents, and in the presence of the Greeks, who understood the conversation through an interpreter, asked them what price would make them burn their dead fathers with fire. They shouted aloud, "Don't mention such horrors." These are matters of settled custom, and I think Pindar is right when he says, custom or law, nomos, is king of all. Now, what's interesting about that is the difference between the barbarians, the Indians in this case, and the Greeks. Herodotus was a Greek, so he actually is preferring his own here, is that the Greeks hear about an alternative custom and say, we don't do it that way, we'd never do it that way, you can't pay us to do it that way. The Indians hear about the alternative, the Greek custom of burning their dead, and they go bananas. They just can't hear it. They scream out against it in horror. They're like the Taurians. The third sort of tribe knows the ways of others, still holds them in contempt, and yet maintains does not hold them in contempt, I'm sorry, and yet still maintains its own ways. Part of which includes something like an awareness of the other. Now, this peculiar self-awareness is what the Greeks understand to be typical of Greek custom, law, nomos. So on the one hand, they have tragedy, an institution within political life that calls into question the fundamental principles of political life and thereby makes it less brutal, more civilized, more political. You know that Aeschylus wrote a tragedy called The Persians only 8 years after the total defeat of the Persians at Salamis. And he looks at the battle, this is to be presented to Athenians, he looks at the battle from the Persian point of view. It's possible to do that in Athens. So the Greeks are political. They not only have nomoi, customs, all people do. Wherever you have people, you have such things. The Greeks self-consciously make their nomoi, their laws. So we've done this before too. The Greeks exercise naked, gymnazein. On the one hand, they recognize the character of clothing as particular, as local, as style, as something that sets you off from other people. And on the other hand, they make nakedness their clothing. What's unique to them, because they don't hide it as shameful, but wear it openly. So the Greeks are the poetic people. All people have myths. The Greeks understand their myths as myths. They worship the Muses. They worship Dionysus, the god of the theater. So in a host of ways, the Greeks make it a matter of their own to be able to stand back from their own and do it without undermining the ownness of their own. Okay, what the Greeks as a people point to is at the heart of being a person. You could say they can claim to be a human civilization on the highest level because the doubleness within Greekness, what they pride themselves on, is a reflection of the doubleness of the human as human. So there's always a tension between being human and being a citizen, between the soul and the city, between nature, phusis, and convention, nomos. Greek tragedy, then, characterizes a culture that minimizes this tension by celebrating it in various ways. Now, this makes it, last digression and conclusion really, this makes it particularly useful for us to study. Not just because Greek tragedy somehow stands at the origin of Western culture, that is because it's ours, but because it aims at something very, very good. We live in an age, a postmodern age, that seems increasingly liable to two extremes. There's, on the one hand, either a willful embracing of our own just because it's our own, or on the other hand, a sort of will-less universalism so intent on things like diversity and pluralism that it fails to recognize that diversity vanishes entirely when it literally doesn't matter what you care about. So we're tossed between a dogmatic and blind optimism on the one hand, and a self-destructive and nihilistic pessimism on the other hand. But, as the French philosopher Pascal once said, we know too little to be dogmatists, and we know too much to be skeptics. So, Greek tragedy is great because it pulls us back to this troubling but really quintessentially human middle ground and tries to induce us to understand it and thereby understand ourselves. Now, when I talk about Greekness in this way, it of course sounds as though this is the only place you can find it. It is a place an awful lot of smart people have found it. I mean, the tendency of thinkers to go back to the Greeks has been with us at least for 300 years now, either to oppose them because they're the greatest threat to what you want to embrace, or to reinvent them because we've lost something important because we no longer. So it's not a negligible example, but of course it's a poetic image. It's not because they're Greek. It's even for Herodotus that really wasn't true. Even for the people who celebrated the Greekness wasn't true. It was just a way of indicating what a culture is when it's at its best, and it's not at its best when it suppresses that dualism in us between, on the one hand, when it tells us simply to do what's natural or do what feels natural, or don't think about what you're doing, just embrace your own because it's your own, on the one hand, and on the other hand, when it tells you utterly ignore that, pay no attention to it, your claims to superiority are, just your claims to superiority, and you shouldn't worry about that. But when you cancel all claims to superiority, you cancel all claims to seriousness. And as I said before, diversity then turns out to be like eating different kinds of meals on a menu. You just, oh, I think I'll have Chinese tonight. Oh, I think I'll go Indian tomorrow night. That's not serious. That's not culture. Culture has to do with the claim that certain things are good, beautiful, true, just. And you have to take that seriously if you're really going to take that culture seriously. You can't say, oh, but that's what they say. That we don't need to take that. We're just doing that because we want to broaden ourselves. Maybe, but where'd this idea of broadening yourself come from? What's so good about that? Those things need a lot of thought. Greek tragedy is, in a way, a wedge into understanding how to begin to thinking seriously about things like that. And it's not an accident that it's hard, that it makes you, if you take it seriously, it makes you unhappy. You may applaud it at the end of Act 5 in Hamlet, but you certainly can't be pleased with it, can you? Anyway, I think I'm done, probably early, the way I said. Anybody want to say anything, ask anything before we stop?